Okay, hey, we're just going to keep on going from the earlier broadcast today. I had a good rhythm, and I know better than to just throw that away. So I want to go ahead and finish the liturgical books chapter, and then maybe the liturgical places chapter after it. We'll see. We'll just do prayers briefly. Hold on. One moment. Sorry about this. Okay. We'll do prayers again as we did this morning. I'll do it in Latin this time. Domine exaudi orationem meam et clamo meus ante veniant oremus. Creator ineffabilis, qui de tesare sapienzae tuae tres angelorum hierarchias designasti, et eo super caelum imperium miro ordine collocasti, atque universe partes elegantissime disposuisti, tu in quam qui verus fons luminis et sapienzae diceris ac superveniens principium fundere digneris super intellectus mei tenebris tuae radium claritatis, duplices in quibus natus sum a me removens tenebras, peccatum scilicet et ignoratiam, tu qui linguas infantium facis desertas, lingua meam erudius atque in labius meis curatium tuae benedictione infundas, damici intelligente acumen, retinende capacitatem, adicendem modum et facilitatem, interpretandi subtilitatem, loquendi gratium copiosum, ingressum instruas, progressum derigas, egressum compleas, tu quies verus Deus et homo, qui vives et regnas in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Okay. I stopped at books for the divine office because that gets into a whole other thing, so we'll continue there. And if you're lost, just consult stream 3. 2. Books for the divine office. The breviary is a relatively modern invention. It is indeed an abbreviation for the numerous books which used to be employed for the chanting of the office. The Psalter, the Homilary, the Passional, the Hymnal, the Antiphonary, and the Martyrology. The Psalter. After the Church decided to use the Psalms instead of hymns for the body of her canonical hours, the former were lifted from the Bible in form of a book of their own. At least 4 different types of Psalter were used by the Church. A. The simple text of the Psalms in the numerical order in which they appear in the Bible. B. The Psalms according to the same numerical order but with marginal notes indicating the day of the week on which they were recited. C. The Psalms still in biblical numerical order, but with the ordinarium de tempore, a complex of hymns, antiphons, versicles, and little chapters. D. The Psalms in the order in which they are recited during the week. There are 3 versions of the Psalms currently in use for the divine office. The oldest, called the Roman, is that which resulted from St. Jerome's correction of the Vetus Latinae or Italia version. It was used in Rome until the time of Pius V. Jerome made another version of the Psalter from the Septuagint. This is the one contained in the Vulgate and is called the Gallican Psalter because it was used in Frankish territory, though later it was imposed by Pius V on all following the Roman Rite. Recently, Pius XII authorized the use of a new version of the Psalter made from the original Hebrew. The Homilary was a collection of patristic homilies for use as commentaries on the scripture readings of Matins. Though the Middle Ages saw many such collections, that made by Paul Warnefriend, died 797, succeeded in becoming almost universal in the West. The Passional was a volume from which the lives and sufferings of the martyrs were read at Matins. Sometimes a different book was used for the lives of confessors, the legendary. Such books multiplied incredibly, and as time went on, the lives increased in length, all the while incorporating items which were not always authentic. The martyrology. In the early church, at least the principal communities were accustomed to note down the days on which their martyrs suffered in order to observe these dates each year. Such names of martyrs and later other saints would be read on the anniversary day from the diptychs, two tables connected by a hinge containing the names of the persons to be specifically commemorated at liturgical services. It was from such documents that later generations made up their calendars, lists of feasts ordinarily celebrated each year, and martyrologies, lists of saints' names to be read to the public on the day of their death. Almost every church and city had its own calendar and martyrology. In addition to a bare mention of the saint or martyr, sometimes these martyrologies would give further pertinent items concerning the lives of these persons. Somewhere between 336 and 354, Furius Dionysius Filiocolus made a single calendar out of two earlier ones, the Deposito Episcoporum and the Deposito Martyrium. One of the earliest martyrologies for the entire church is the so-called Martyrology of St. Jerome, which originated between 592 and 600. On the other hand, the Venerable Bede, died 735, was the first to compile an historical martyrology, one, in other words, containing a few lists of facts, the lives of the saints, in addition to the mere mention of their names. However, the most influential of all medieval martyrologies was that composed by the monk Euardus, died 877. He increased the number of saints reported and abbreviated the historical notices concerning them, thus bringing the book to the form which it kept during the rest of the Middle Ages. It was his volume that Pope Gregory XIII entrusted for revision to several learned men, among them the Baronus and Angelius, and subsequently imposed on the Latin Church. The hymnal contained the many metrical compositions intended to be sung during the divine office. Such volumes flourished in the Middle Ages. C. Bloom has already collected some 30,000 hymns. 3. Books of chant. The musical parts of the Mass sung by the Schola Cantorum, Introit, Offertory, Communion were gathered together in a book called the Antiphonary, while those sung by a soloist, gradual, tract, or Alleluia verse, were contained in the Cantorium. We know that Gregory the Great compiled an antiphonary, but unfortunately it survives only in manuscripts dating from the Carolingian period. In time, both these books were combined and from the 9th century on began to be called gradualia. Originally, these chant books did not contain notation, only the text. The music apparently was sung from memory. Since this presented an obvious difficulty for the choirs, from the 8th century on, musical signs or neumes of some sort or another began to appear in the manuscripts. The neumes at first were not for the choir as a whole, but only for the director, who would attempt to describe them in the air with gestures of the hand, whence the name Charionomy, law of the hand. More and more attempts were made to describe these musical intervals graphically by printing neumes higher or lower, now above a single line, now below it, until finally Guido de Arezzo, circa 1027, developed a 4-line system with which he was able to express every interval perfectly. Another book, the Troparius, contained the tropes or phrases which were inserted into certain sung parts of the Mass, the Kyrie, the Sanctus, the Hallelujah, Gloria, Agnus Dei. We still see a remnant of this practice in the titles given to the Gregorian Masses contained in the Kyrial, Lux et Origio, Fons, Bonitas, etc. These were the tropes inserted into the Kyrie. Rubric books. Thus far, we have described books which contain texts to be read or sung during divine services. Still another type of book was needed to organize and harmonize all the texts and actions of the liturgy. This was the ordo, or ordinal, the manual of rubrics for the master of ceremonies. These ordinals were subsequently broken down into the ceremonial episcoporum for those sacramental rites pertaining to bishops, and the ritual and missal for those rites administered by priests. Monsieur, with just M. Andreu, has edited a series of ordinal manuscripts, the earliest of which date from the 9th century, but which undoubtedly describe liturgical ceremonies of previous centuries. The Ordo Romanus Primus even portrays the papal liturgy of the 7th century. Such documents are of the greatest importance for the history of the Roman Rite, for they alone will yield the details of liturgical ceremonial. The other books rarely contain rubrical directions. C. Condensation into modern books. In general, it seems due to the growing practice of private celebration of Mass that a rearrangement of the liturgical books occurred. While it is true that the books we have thus far considered were primarily intended for use in the cathedrals and churches of large cities, as well as monasteries, where it was possible to assemble enough clergy for the offices of deacon, subdeacon, and lector, the country parishes also endeavored to remain faithful to the principle of a hierarchy of ministers. Only where it was impossible to find a good reader, cantor, or choir would the priest execute some of the parts belonging to other ministers. This seems to be borne out by the fact that the earliest missals we could find originated in monasteries where, we know, the practice of private masses also gained momentum. This practice of the missa lecta, offered by the priest alone, had, as we shall see, very unfortunate consequences for the development of the Roman Rite. In keeping with this growing desire to celebrate privately, even daily, the monks and priests who traveled, at one time the clerici vagabundi, became somewhat of a menace, found it inconvenient to have to carry along with them so many different manuals. A compendium in which could be found all the essential texts of the Mass combined into one volume was a welcome luxury. The Missal of Bobbio, from its very smallness, was probably intended for such a purpose. Once the movement got underway to assemble all the Mass texts in one book, it was only a small step to bring them together. It was only a small step to bring together the formulas and ceremonies of the administration of the sacraments into another book, the elements necessary for the recitation of the divine office, until still another, and so on. 1. The Missal. In general, the historical evolution of our modern Missal can be said to have gone through 4 periods. Until approximately the 7th century, the hierarchical celebration of the liturgy by a plurality of ministers was more or less strictly adhered to. A plurality of liturgical books was then the normal thing. With the 7th century, however, we enter upon the second period, wherein the private Mass begins to intrude. Here, there are found isolated instances where the priest's Mass book contains not only his part, but also other parts of the Mass, which until this time had been reserved to the minor ministers. In this second period, where the Bobbio Missal is the earliest example, the manuscripts range from those including the lessons to those that even insist on the sung text being recited by the celebrant. The 12th century was the culmination of this period, for by that time the Missal was a book which contained everything said or done at Mass. A third period opens with the 13th century, in which the Franciscans propagated the Missal of the Roman Curia in their missionary journeys throughout Europe. The utility of the Missal was easily seen by the clergy they visited. It was quickly adopted, and its use became almost universal. A fourth and final period followed, that in which pontifical authority entered into the regulation of the Missal. Even after the curial Missal became universal, local bishops and abbots did not hesitate to modify it to suit their tastes. The Council of Trent, seeing the disorder which reigned in the celebration of the Mass, nominated a commission to see the unification of texts and ceremonies. The commission's reform was brought to an end when its work was promulgated by Pius V in 1570. According to his bull of promulgation, quo primum, every diocese and order of the Latin Rite was obliged to adopt the Reformed Missal, the only exceptions being those regions and orders whose liturgies enjoyed a tradition of at least 200 years. Although the Missal underwent later changes under Clement the Eighth, 1604, Urban the Eighth, 1634, and Benedict the 15th, 1920. These were merely of minor rubrical nature. Hence, our present Missal is substantially the same as that imposed by Pius V. 2. The Pontifical. A relatively modern volume, the Pontifical as a separate book took its origin outside of Rome. Just as in the case of the Missal, the more ancient contents of the Pontifical were originally to be found either in the sacramentaries, the formulas, or in the ordinals, the rubrical directions. When it became the practice to codify different rites into separate books, it was only natural that those functions proper to the bishop were placed in a special volume called the Liber Pontificalis. Some of the earliest attempts at compiling such books took place in England, France, and Germany. There was the Pontifical of Egbert of York, 732 to 766, the Pontifical of Portares, circa 800, and the Romano-Germanic Pontifical of the 10th century from Mainz. Hittorp called the latter the Ordo Romanus Antiquus, but its contents show that as a whole it is neither Roman nor ancient. It is rather a compilation of Roman and Gallican sources. This Romano-Germanic Pontifical is of the greatest importance for the development of our present Roman Pontifical, for it was precisely this book that was brought to Rome, probably by one of the Ottos in the course of the 10th century, and adopted there. The book, of course, had to be adopted to local exigencies, and thus arose the Roman Pontifical of the 12th century. The first ordo of papal ceremonies executed under papal auspices. During the 13th century, this pontifical was revised, probably under Innocent III, 1198 to 1216, and is known as the Pontifical of the Roman Curia of the 13th century. Another work that exercised great influence upon the ultimate formulation of our pontifical was that of William Durand, died 1296, longtime canonist of the Papal Curia and finally Bishop of Mende. His reputation was such that it gave his pontifical great authority, and it was widely adopted. Additionally, it combined most of the rites until then observed in Rome with many other elements from Gallican sources. Innocent VIII, 1484 to 1492, adopted it for Rome itself and charged Patricius Piccolomini, the future Pius II, and John Bertrand to make a revision of it. This the Pope offered to the bishops of the Latin Rite as authentic Roman practice. Piccolomini's pontifical underwent revision after revision. In 1496 by James de Lucis, in 1511 by Julius II, who was the first to use the title Pontificale, in 1520 by the Dominican Albert Castellani, and in 1561 by Pius V. Before this, the popes had seen to it that the formulas of the pontifical were orthodox and an authentic reproduction of Roman practice. They did not, however, impose the book generally. Following out the wishes of the Council of Trent that the received and approved rites for the administration of the sacraments should not be departed from, Clement VIII, in 1595, promulgated a new edition of the Pontificale Romanum and obliged all churches in the Latin Rite to use it. 3. The Ritual. Similar to the manual containing episcopal ceremonies was another collection of formulas needed by the priest in his sacramental ministrations. At a relatively early date, we have evidence of a special priest's manual. The Council of Toledo, 633, for example, orders bishops to provide their pastors with a libellius officialis for the rites proper to them. Unfortunately, none of these libelli are extant. The earliest example of a monastic ritual is that of St. Florian of the 12th century, while the first attempt at an official diocesan ritual would be the 14th century manual of Bishop Heinrich I of Breslau. From this time on, we often find such manuals for the use of the secular clergy called Agenda, Liber Ritualis, Sacerdotalia, Pastoriale, Manuale, or Obsquiale. Of particular importance for the ultimate form of our present Roman ritual were the two Sacerdotale of Albert Castellani, 1537, and of Francesco Samarini, 1579, and of the Ritual Sacramentorum Romanum compiled by Cardinal Santorio, 1584, by the order of Gregory XIII. The latter book was the basis for the Ritual Romanum, published as the official ritual of the Roman Rite by Pope Paul V in 1614. Prudently, the Pope did not impose the use of this ritual, but only warmly recognized it. There was such a variety of regional differences that he feared it would disturb the faithful too much were he to suppress the differences. The collection was well received and was modified and added to by subsequent popes. Though the editions published by recent popes were called typical, the Roman ritual still has never been officially imposed on the Latin Church. Nevertheless, the de facto universality of its own use gives its formulas and rubrics the force of law. The practice of Pius XII of approving of national rituals as appendices of the Ritual Romanum seems to confirm this view. 4. The Breviary. The constant practice of the Church up until the 11th century was to insist on maintaining the choral recitation of the divine office for both monks and secular clergy. This does not mean that private recitation was unknown or disapproved. The normal manner of reciting the office, however, was in choir. After the 11th century, this practice began to yield more and more to private recitation. To make the latter easier, all the pertinent texts and rubrics were gathered from the various books in use up until that time, and an abbreviation, breviarium, or contraction of them was made. This consisted mainly in the elimination of the musical notation and a radical shortening of the readings. Such abbreviations became frequent in the 13th century. Innocent III approved one of these breviaries for his curia. The Franciscans adopted the abbreviations approved by Innocent III and added them to the Gallican Psalter. This revised breviary was then prescribed for the churches of Rome by Pope Nicholas III, 1277 to 1280. A second time, the friars minor hastened to the spread of the Roman liturgy, this time by carrying out their breviaries all over Europe. Notwithstanding the efforts of Cardinal Quignones to establish the use of another form of breviary in 1536, the type propagated by the Franciscans became the basis of the breviary made obligatory in the Latin Rite by Pius V in 1568. Again, the retention of all breviaries having at least a 200-year tradition behind them was allowed. Many reforms took place after this. To note only a few, Clement VIII brought the scriptural readings into conformity with the Vulgate, while Urban VIII revised some of the rubrics and so-called corrected the Latinity of the metrical hymns. Leo XIII retouched many of the historical lessons, and Pius X restored the Psalter to its early arrangement, thus making allowance for a weekly recitation of practically all 150 psalms. Finally, Pius XII permitted the use of the new translation of the Psalms from the original Hebrew text and sanctioned the simplification of rubrics and reduction in rank of many feasts. D. Liturgical Law. Before the time of St. Pius V, there existed a much greater liberty in liturgical matters. We have already noted the slow progression from localized liturgical legislative power to a strictly centralized authority. The institution of feasts and rites, as well as their alteration and suppression, rested with the local ordinaries, sometimes even with pastors. There were, of course, frequent abuses. This is why the popes have tried from time to time to restrict this right. Pius V succeeded in doing just this, but only for the contents of certain liturgical books. The Code of Canon Law definitively reserved to the Holy See all powers regarding the institution of feasts, the editing of liturgical books, as well as for any changes in the rites. In his encyclical Mediator Dei, Pius XII explains this legislation as meaning that the sovereign pontiff alone enjoys the right to recognize and establish any practice touching the worship of God, to introduce new rites, as also to modify those he judges to require modification. The obligation to accept whatever changes the Holy See deems fit to make regarding the books and rites of the Latin Church is in itself a grave one. The gravity of the obligation always depending on the tenor of the pontifical documents. When it is certain that the Roman pontiffs wish to oblige all to a certain manner of executing the sacred liturgy, all are obliged sub gravi, allowance being made for like matter, to conform to such prescribed ritual unless a sufficient reason excuses. In one of its canons on the sacraments, the Council of Trent condemns anyone who would hold that the approved rites of the Church may be treated with contempt, omitted without sin by ministers whenever they so desire, or changed for new ones by any pastor whatsoever. By way of explanation of such a stand on the part of the Church, Pius XII states, "Private individuals, even though they be clerics, may not be left to decide for themselves in these holy and venerable matters, involving as they do the religious life of Christian society, along with the exercise of the priesthood of Jesus Christ and the worship of God." Chapter 4. Liturgical Places. A. The Church and its Furnishings. The Christian church is not an ordinary building. One cannot simply throw up 4 walls, cover them with a roof, and call such a structure a church. The Christian church must have a special meaning which is ultimately based on its purpose. In other words, it must be different from those structures used by anti-sacramental sects. It is not simply a meeting house or auditorium. It is even less a museum or theater. Early Christians gave a name to their place of worship, which expresses well its true meaning. They called it the Domus Dei, or house of God. Christian writers also used combinations or derivatives of the same expression. The Dominicum, the Lord's, Domus Dominica, the Lord's house, and Domus Ecclesiae, the church's house. Our English word church comes from the German Kirche, which in turn is derived from the Greek Kyriakon, meaning the Lord's. The common Latin term ecclesia means the assembling, a calling together. The Romance languages retained this root in their Cesia, Iglise, and Iglesia. The ancient church also used another word, basilica, or house of the king, for the principal churches. The church, then, looks upon her place of worship as the house of God, something belonging to the Lord, the place where the faithful assemble, the house of the king. Let us recall that it was not the Eucharistic presence which gave the name House of God to the church. The reservation of the Blessed Sacrament is a much later development. The church was called the House of God because his sacred mysteries, his sacraments, were enacted there, because his children assembled there and broke with their heavenly Father the bread of life, and because they gathered to hear his word as he spoke to them in the sacred scriptures. This sacred building, therefore, must in some way reflect in its very structure the holiness of what takes place within its walls. Its construction is not an occasion for the artist or architect to erect a monument to his own personality, nor for any given people to express its national character to such a degree as to obscure the essential nature and primary purpose of the church building. Let us trace the development of the church structure throughout history and see what success the church has met with in adapting this principle to concrete circumstances and particular ages. 1. Origin and development of the church building. Primitive churches were nothing else than the private homes of early Christians who were financially well off. Perhaps the early appellation Domus Ecclesiae referred to houses held in common by the church, a house belonging to the church, though it was not always possible in the beginning because of lack of legal security for the Christians in those years common ownership did become a reality later. But the expression domus ecclesiae also indicated that the exterior, and very likely the interior of the primitive church, remained faithful to the appearance and plan of the Roman house. And here's a diagram. I'm not going to try to verbally describe the diagram, but you can look at it. And it is labeled, and I'll say those numbers, but you'll have to look at them. I'll try to flip back and forth. The Roman house was essentially made up as follows. 1, the ostium or entrance, right there. 2, atrium, a large central hall with no windows, but an opening in the roof to permit light to enter. That's right there. 3, impluvium, the impluvium, a small pond in the center of the floor directly under the hole in the roof for the purpose of catching the rain. And that's right there. 4, the tablinum, a room at the far end of the atrium, raised by several steps, one side of which was completely open to the atrium. It was used as a combination home shrine, reception room, and general family sitting room. Right there. 5, surrounding the atrium were other common and private rooms, such as a dining room, triclinium, and a kitchen, as well as bedrooms and servants' quarters. All those. 5, all those. 6, a cartibulum or table often stood in the atrium near the tablinum. Excuse me, near the tablinum. That's right there. 7, in imitation of Greek architecture, another section was added to the rich noble's house. It consisted of, and this, well, it lists it as, okay, it's 7, so it's this whole section. It consisted of 8, the open garden or peristylium, right there. 9, surrounded by a covered walk. 9. And 10, the private rooms for the family. Right there. 11, at the far end was to be found the oikos, or family sitting room. The tablinum and other rooms in the atrium section were given over to the servants. And it's right there. For Christian worship, the atrium became the place where the body of the faithful stood, our present nave. The impluvium was very convenient for the administration of baptism. The cartibulum was used as an altar. It was also possible that it was carried into the tablinum, where the bishop's throne was normally placed, so that all might be able to see the sacred action. But in the Greco-Roman houses, the atrium was reserved for the catechumens and penitents, while the faithful occupied the peristylium, and the altar and the bishop's throne were placed in the oikos. The Latin basilica. Even in pre-Constantine times, special halls had been built for Christian worship. There's a note, and it's actually a long and good note, so I'm going to read it. I normally don't read footnotes, but this is a footnote with reference to even in pre-Constantine times. Religious services in the catacombs need not detain us here. They exercised no influence over the development of the Christian church, except insofar as they heightened devotion to the martyrs. It is a general but erroneous opinion that during the persecutions, at least, Mass was held regularly in the catacombs. This is based on a popular misconception of these cemeteries and on more romantic than realistic belief that early Christians could hide in them. The catacombs were public places and well known to the pagan authorities and people. See especially L. Hertling, E. Kirchbong, the Roman catacombs and their martyrs. They would not serve as a hiding place or a safe locale for celebrating the Mass any better than the private homes of Roman citizens. The narrowness of the passages would certainly not suit them for an assembly place, and the humidity and presence of decaying corpses would not recommend them from a hygienic point of view. It is hardly thinkable, therefore, that these circumstances would encourage a frequent and regular religious service. Whatever services were held in the catacombs had a strictly exceptional character, that is, a funeral or anniversary celebration, and these later were customarily held above ground in a little chapel, cella memorae or cella martyris, built directly above the place where the martyr was buried. These were so small that only the celebrant or at most the ministers could enter. The rest of the faithful had to remain outside. Back to the bulk of the text. Even in pre-Constantian times, special halls had been built for Christian worship. These were made necessary by the ever-increasing number of faithful. With the coming of the peace under Constantine, this problem grew to enormous proportions and necessitated even larger buildings. The architectural type chosen for these churches was what we today call the Latin basilicas. Soon after his victory over Maxentius in 312, Constantine had a sumptuous basilica erected over what was once a military encampment near the house of the Latrian family. This basilica, originally called the Basilica of the Savior, but renamed in the 12th century by Pope Lucius II as St. John Lateran, was the first cathedral of Rome and still is the city's cathedral. It is often referred to as the mother of Christian churches. To show his devotion to St. Peter, Constantine also built the first martyr's shrine over the tomb of St. Peter in the Vatican Cemetery. By 345, the two building projects of Constantine had set the pace for years to come. We have the beginning of the Christian basilica and the Christian monument, styles which were to be copied until the late Middle Ages. Since it was during the era after the persecutions that the Roman liturgy developed its classical lines, and did this within the walls of these Latin basilicas, this architectural type has a special claim on our attention and respect. We will see later how this form, more than any other, suits the liturgical ceremonial of the Latin West, both for the interpretation of ideas and in actual practice. Though St. John Lateran and St. Peter's were the original basilicas, the latter has been completely rebuilt in another style, and the former has been thoroughly modified. The churches in Rome, which best represent the pure basilica type, are San Clemente, Santa Maria in Cosmedin, and Santa Sabina. An analysis of these churches provides the following floor plan. I'll let you look at the picture. And like the last time, I'm not going to try to describe it, but I'll point back to it when the text describes. 1, altar, right there. 2, bishop's throne, right there. 3, seats for the clergy, right there. 4, area for the schola cantorum, right there. 5, gospel ambo, right there. 6, epistle ambo, right there. 7, congregation. 8, catechumens. 9, penitents. 10, atrium. 11, fountain. The atrium was a rectangular yard in front of the basilica. It contained a fountain for ablutions and was surrounded by a colonnaded walk. The part of the colonnade against the facade of the basilica was called the narthex, our modern vestibule. The nave was a large hall divided by 2 rows of columns into 3 sections. Men and women were usually separated and occupied the 2 smaller sections of the nave or side naves, while in the middle near the sanctuary was located a fenced-off area reserved for the Schola Cantorum. The sanctuary, at the opposite end of the nave from the atrium, was slightly elevated and rounded out in a shell-like form or asp. Some of the Latin basilicas had transepts which enlarged the width of the building just before the apse. The asp. No, the apse, excuse me. Since the bishop's throne was located against the back wall of the apse, it was only natural that the altar was placed between him and the people. This was the arrangement in the Roman house church, and it seems rather obvious that the basilica floor plan simply followed the example of its forerunner. Hence, the original reason for the altar facing the people was the hierarchical setup of the church. The bishop's throne was the center of activity and attraction, and thus it stood at the point facing all. When the bishop approached the altar, he did the natural thing and went directly to the side facing him. At the altar, as the throne, he continued his role as representative. This note is about orientation. Again, since this is a current controversy, and I'm not saying I endorse the historical account he's putting here now, but since this is a current controversy, I'll go ahead and read this note. This note was with respect of, hence the original reason for the altar facing the people was the hierarchical setup of the church, and he notes it thus. Veneration of the martyrs' relics buried beneath or within the altar and the alleged near-universal principle of orientation are put forth by some as reason for the altar being built facing the people. The principle of orientation, that is, of facing the east at prayer, in no wise affected the Roman liturgy. Not only do we not find any trace of an official practice of this kind in Rome itself, but Leo I was definitively opposed to it as a remnant of paganism. See F.J. Doliger, Sol Salutis, Munster 1925, 3-5. It was only in the Oriental and Gallican rites that this idea found acceptance. CFJ Quaston, Monumenta, page 35, note 1. M. Andreu, note sur une ancienne redaction. I can't read French. At the citations. The idea certainly, therefore, had nothing to do with the altar facing the people in Rome. Rather, it contributed to the discontinuance of this practice elsewhere. For the principle of orientation, when rightly carried out, meant that the apse was at the east end of the church, the facade at the west. Hence, the normal position of the priest at Mass in orientated churches was on the people's side of the altar. The other reason alleged for this type of altar, namely that it was to permit the people to approach the altar and venerate the relics of the martyrs buried there, or because of the presence of the confession or sunken pit immediately before the altar, is not at all convincing. Such confessions were not built on the people's side of the altar until the 16th century. See F. Grossi Condi, I Monumenti Christiani, Rome, 1923, 431, note 2. Before this era, confessions did exist, but they were crypts built behind the altar and beneath the floor of the sanctuary. The people were allowed access to them by means of stairways on either side of the apse, but even these crypts date only from the 6th century. Hence, the altar versus populum arrangement antedates the consecration of confessions of either type. The bishop's throne was the center of activity and attraction, and thus it stood at a point facing all. When the bishop approached the altar, he did the natural thing and went directly to the side facing him. At the altar, as at the throne, he continued his role as representative from God to the people, breaking bread with the children of God's household. What is the origin of the basilica-type church? This is a question that has been disputed for some time. Though archaeologists have concerned themselves with the problem for more than 70 years, none of the solutions proposed have so far met with general acceptance. There are those who consider the Christian basilica to have been derived from the Roman forensic basilicas. In general, the Christian basilica does resemble the public imperial ones, but there are dissimilarities. The side naves of the Christian basilicas are lower than the central one, and the latter is pierced with windows. In the civil basilicas, all the naves are of the same height. The atrium and transept often found in Christian basilicas are never part of the civil ones. The very items which serve to differentiate the Christian from the public basilica tend at the same time to identify it with the plan of the Roman house. In private Roman mansions, the peristyle was clearly the biggest section of the house. Were this roofed over against the weather in such a way as to allow space for windows, a clerestory would be produced. This would explain how the side naves of the Christian basilica came to be lower than the central nave. The apse is easily seen as a transformation of the oikos, or family reception room. The atrium of Christian basilicas also finds an obvious precedent in the same feature of the Roman house. This explanation of the origin of the Christian basilica is, according to Grissard, the simplest and most probable. Still, a third theory considers the Christian church to be a combination of various elements, principally the Roman house and forensic basilica. This is the option most widespread among archaeologists. They see the influence of the Roman house in the higher evaluation of the They see the influence of the Roman house in the higher elevation of the central nave over the side ones, and the frequent use of the atrium and apse. The influence of the public basilicas is seen in the length and general height of the Christian church. Certainly, if the early Christians adopted the general plan of the larger quarters of the Roman house for their churches, they did not do so slavishly, but rather adapted appropriate elements from other already existing buildings and attempted a fusion of all the elements. Romanesque. From the 8th to the 10th century, the West saw the rise of a new type of church, the Romanesque. This is the term for those phases of European architecture which were based on Roman art. Romanesque arose from the ruins of Europe after the barbarian invasions. Thus, the old Roman art was the quarry for the new architecture. To that degree, it necessarily determined the latter's character. It must also be admitted that Byzantine art exercised some influence on the birth of this new style, for it had traveled its way to the west through the great trade centers Venice, Ravenna, Marseille. In addition to these basic influences, we find that regional differences in climate and geological resources determined many of the particularities of the Romanesque style throughout Europe. The principal characteristics of this form of architecture may be summed up in the following points. 1. Plan. Transepts, generally of the same breadth as the nave, were added to the latter, and the sanctuary was extended, thus making the floor plan a well-defined cross. The sanctuary was usually raised above the level of the nave and rested on piers over a vaulted crypt. Later churches often carried aisles all the way round the sanctuary to form a deambulatory, thus allowing people to visit votive chapels behind the sanctuary. Towers began to appear at the east and west ends above the spot where the nave and transepts meet. The altar is deep in the sanctuary, far away from the nave. 2. Ceiling. All three naves, or more, depending on the immensity of the church, usually had vaulted ceilings which were formed as a half-cylinder or semicircle. In some places, these vaults were stilted, that is, lifted slightly higher than a regular semicircle would warrant. Molded ribs were often employed here and there to reinforce these vaults. Frequently crossed vaults are to be seen, that is, a ceiling formed by a series of intersecting bolts. Some architects also used a system of internal flying buttresses to support the vaulted ceiling of the middle nave. These they would hide between the ceiling and roof of the side naves. 3. Walls. The exterior walls were thick and heavy, often reinforced with buttresses formed of pilaster strips connected at the top by a band of horizontal molding or by a series of semicircle arches. The thickness of the walls was necessitated by the heavy downward thrust of the vaulted ceilings. 4. Openings. Doors and windows were characteristically arched in semicircular fashion, while their jambs or sides formed a series of receding concentric rings. Due to the thick walls, windows were usually few and small. Some of the more important examples of this type of architecture are Saint Sernin in Toulouse, 11th to 12th century, Notre Dame la Grande in Portes, 12th century, St. Ambrose in Milan, 12th century, the Cathedral of Modena, 12th century, the Cathedral of Parma, 11th to 12th century, San Miniato of Florence, 12th century, the Pisa Cathedral and its Baptistery, 11th, 12th century, the Benedictine Abbey Church of Maria Laach, 12th century, the Cathedral of Speyer, 11th, 12th century, and the Cathedral of Mainz, 12th to 13th century. Gothic. The evolution of Romanesque into Gothic came almost insensibly, for the skeleton that was hidden in the former only gradually lost its skin and flesh. The stresses became more and more obvious. Flying buttresses were devised to carry away the thrust of the pointed arches of the vaults. This, of course, relieved the weight on the walls, which then could be pierced with more and larger windows. But so-called Gothic is a misnomer. It is synonymous with barbaric. Christopher Wren first used it as a term of reproach for this departure from the classical lines of architecture. A more exact descriptive name would be ogival architecture, for this refers to the distinctive pointed arch used in the vaults of this type of church. Born in the north of France, ogival architecture began to appear in the 12th century, reached its apogee in the 13th and 14th centuries, and in the 15th began its decline, scorned by the rising Renaissance. The essential characteristics of ogival architecture are thus. 1. The flying buttress. The vault thrusts are both downward by reason of gravitation and outward by reason of the action of the voussoirs, wedge-shaped stones in the arch. Both stresses are collected by the meeting of the ribs at the angles of the vaulting compartments. The resulting pressure is oblique or slanting, and this is counteracted and transmitted to the ground by the flying buttresses, these in turn being weighted down by the pinnacles. 2. The pointed arch and rib. The pointed arch helps to direct the stress downward rather than outward, so that the weight of the pinnacle can more easily prevent the buttresses from overturning. And the ribs play an even more important role in Gothic than they did in Romanesque, for now the network of ribs actually support the panels of the vaults. In other words, the arches of the Gothic church are formed of strong ribs upon which are laid very thin stone panels. It is these arched ribs which gather the pressure from above, carry it to the angles of the vaults, and then pass it on to the flying buttresses. 3. With such a heavily developed system for disposing of the stresses and strains, the walls are no longer necessary as supports. They are now nothing more than enclosures. This enables the Gothic architect to pierce the side of the church with huge and delicately designed windows. In some instances, we find churches whose walls are mostly glass, suffering only occasional interruptions for a buttress. La Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. 4. Thus, the architect is now permitted to add greater emphasis on height and slenderness. The Gothic church seems to reach to heaven. These qualities of the church are indeed great feats of engineering, but sometimes the emphasis on height and slenderness produce untoward effects as far as liturgical worship is concerned. Often the naves and aisles were endlessly long, the altar far away. This had tragic consequences for active participation in the sacred mysteries. Also to be deplored is a piece of furniture, quite incidental to Gothic, often found in Gothic churches, the so-called rood screen. This is a wall, sometimes of marble, sometimes of glass and columns, sometimes only a grille with or without curtains, located between the sanctuary or choir and the nave. Above it is placed a cross, rood, or Calvary group. Beautiful though it may be in some instances, it admirably succeeds in cutting off the people's view of the altar and reducing considerably their participation in the Mass. Its origin is somewhat obscure. It may have begun as a support, pure and simple, for the Calvary group above, or it may have been an exaggerated development of the chancel or communion rail. It may have been designed originally for the comfort of the choir to reduce the draft so frequent in the huge cathedrals, or finally, it may have started as an unreasonable bringing back of the old basilical enclosure for the Schola Cantorum. Historians have not come to a definitive conclusion. Some of the best examples of Gothic architecture are Notre Dame of Paris, 12th to 13th century, Notre Dame of Chartres, 12th to 13th century, Notre Dame of Amiens, 13th century, Notre Dame of Reims, 13th century, the Lieb Frankfurt Kirche of Trier, Germany, 13th century, the Cathedral of Cologne, 13th to 14th century, the Cathedral of Ulm, 14th to 15th century, St. George of Windsor, 15th century, the Cathedral of Toledo, 13th century, the Cathedral of Burgos, 13th century. Renaissance and Baroque. We naturally look to Italy as the birthplace of Renaissance art and architecture. Gothic had never taken firm root there. Older traditions were too strong. Italy was rich in the lore of ancient Roman civilization. Furthermore, 15th century Christians, partially in reaction to a decadent scholasticism, were busy discovering the riches of the past. Spurred on by the new findings in science and the exploration of the New World, they were constructing a new, man-centered humanism. The cultural inheritance of Greece and Rome became the symbols of the new era. In architecture and art, this meant a return to the forms of classical times. Strangely enough, however, this movement was never a complete return. Although the outward form and decoration were classical, the ancient Roman columns, arches, cornices, and mythological themes, Gothic methods of construction almost always prevailed. Baroque, even in using such forms and themes, came actually as a revolt against the formality and restraint of the almost blind conformity to rules laid down by the earlier Renaissance classicists. Yet, some call Baroque purely pagan in essence. It is naively confused with its predecessor because of outward appearances. Just because Baroque employs classical forms and pagan mythological themes does not make it pagan. In the Renaissance, the horizontal architecture of antiquity was revived in conformity with the horizontal outlook of humanism. Themes from classical mythology are treated for their own sake all too often, not like the mythological representations in Dante's Purgatory to illustrate Christian teaching. Even where the subjects of Renaissance art are sacred, the suspicion looms large that they are mere cloaks for the secular. The impression seems inescapable at times. It is but an attempt to glorify man. Baroque, on the contrary, endeavors to make God incarnate and to spur man on to an ascent to God. It may use the same media of expression as the Renaissance, but it infuses into them a new spirit, Christ and Christianity, as a fulfillment of human aspirations. The infinite in the context of the finite, the vertical as the completion of the horizontal. Watkins defines Baroque as the employment of classical forms by Gothic feeling. Though the matter of Baroque is classical, its so-called form or spirit is Gothic. It may deal with things of sense, but it does this to arrive at the spirit behind them. For when Baroque achieves its aim, it uses the sensible, we may even say sensuous, to signify the spiritualization of sense, the sublimation of man's passionate energy in an ecstatic love of God. For Baroque, everything below is the symbol of something above, every object of sense the symbol of a spiritual reality. This fundamental distinction between Renaissance and Baroque can be clearly brought out by principles of art criticism. Heinrich Wölfflin, whose masterful Principles of Art History appeared in its first German edition in 1915, has taught us once and for all how to appreciate Baroque and to distinguish it from Renaissance. He gives 5 principles, according to which these two styles are clearly distinguished thus. A. Renaissance art is primarily linear and tactile, Baroque primarily what he calls painterly, malerisch, and visual. The emphasis in the former falls upon clearly defined outlines and edges, and therefore things seem limited, isolated, solid, and tangible. In the latter, however, stress is laid upon mass and space, and therefore the attention is withdrawn from the edges. Things seem limitless. They shift, they merge. B. Renaissance art lays stress on the plane, Baroque on the visual third dimension, depth. Plane is the element of line, extension in one plane, the form of greatest explicitness. With the discounting of the contour comes the discounting of the plane, and the eye relates objects essentially to the direction of forwards and backwards. C. In Renaissance art, the closed form is emphasized, in Baroque, the open. Wolflin explains thus: every work of art must be a finite whole, and it is a defect if we do not feel that it is self-contained. But the interpretation of this demand in the 16th and 17th centuries is so different that in comparison with the loose form of the Baroque, classic design may be taken as the form of closed composition. D. The Renaissance stresses multiplicity, Baroque unity of the whole. In the former, though the single parts are rooted in the whole and conditioned by the whole, they still maintain their own life and independence. In Baroque, unity is achieved by a union of parts in a single theme, subordination to one unconditioned dominant. E. Absolute clarity is the aim of Renaissance art, only relative clarity that of Baroque. Composition, light, and color in Baroque no longer merely serve to define form, but have their own life. This is a difference between the representation of things as they are, taken singularly and accessible to plastic feeling, and the representation of things as they look, seen as a whole, by their non-plastic qualities. Thus, in Baroque, a movement purely visual is set going over the sum of forms, independently of particular viewpoint. The wall vibrates, the space quivers in every corner, etc. Even in tectonic art, nothing is to settle into tangible lines and surfaces. Even in tectonic art, the impression of permanence is to be supplanted by the impression of change. Even in tectonic art, form must breathe. That is, apart from all expressional differences, the basic notion of Baroque. The impression of movement, the infinite. As T. Green remarks so well, it is because the Baroque artist saw the world and interpreted life as he did that he gradually evolved those stylistic forms which would most effectively enable him to express what he wished to express. That is, the forms were dictated by the artist's intent. What he wished to express was an emotionally vivid sense of human finitude in the face of cosmic infinity. Baroque was the expression of the Counter-Reformation and its spirit, man's vivid sense of his spiritual relation to God and his dependence on him, the infinite God who had revealed himself to man in Christ, who became incarnate to bring finite man to know and possess the infinite. All Baroque art, whether religious or secular, is curiously expressive of the spirit which permeated the latter 16th and 17th centuries. However, in certain examples of Baroque, often characterized by the term Rococo, we see the danger incurred by a too lavish or otherwise injudicious use of architectural decoration. What Green has to say is quite different to the point. What Green has to say is quite to the point. Decoration is injurious to the architectural effect if it obscures or otherwise renders visually ineffective the main structural forms upon which the building must depend primarily for its architectural expressiveness. When this happens, we have a corresponding loss of our architectural integrity. But the danger lies not so much in the amount of decoration as in its stylistic quality and above all in its relation to the main architectural structure. In this connection, Green points out, the Rococo style in southern Germany of the 18th century was prone to over-decoration that failed to exploit the expressive potentialities of the visible architectonic structure and the building materials. If, therefore, we say that Baroque architecture is not, in all its exemplifications, completely adapted to the needs and exigencies of the Church's liturgy, we do not thereby mean that it is not good art. Its tendency to over-decorate, by that very fact, distracts from and intervenes with the liturgical action. Although the Baroque church essentially draws one directly to the altar, it is not the altar of sacrifice or the table of the sacrificial meal, but rather the throne of the real presence. The former should be the primary liturgical focus, not the latter. In the Baroque church, the meaning of the altar is all too often obscured by its mountainous rear structure. Baroque has indeed sought, by and large, to erect a monstrous monstrance, a sumptuous setting for the Blessed Sacrament. We do not wish to criticize this historical fact. It was perhaps necessary for its time, for the real presence was under fire from the so-called reformers of the North, but it would certainly be a mistake to continue in this vein today. This detailed explanation of the art principles upon which Baroque is based has been necessary to dispel the misunderstanding that has arisen in this regard. As a matter of fact, as we pass from the Gothic into the Renaissance and Baroque periods, we become less conscious of architectural functionalism than of style, perhaps for the very simple reason that now the chief architects were sculptors and painters as well. Man had perfected his art to such a degree, had acquired the ability to manipulate matter and infuse such expressiveness into a building, that the eye of future generations would first be drawn altogether naturally to the artistic style of Baroque, rather than to its architectural and liturgical functionalism. As far as its architectural functionalism is concerned, we have mentioned the fact that good Baroque enjoys a high degree of it, and that its inner structural method is that of Gothic. But now let us turn to the more detailed items of plan and structure. Though circular churches in this period of the Renaissance and the Baroque are not unknown, the plan of the Baroque church is habitually rectangular. When transepts are present, they often form side chapels. The church is generally shorter than in the Gothic period, and the altar stands at the far end of the sanctuary against the back wall and is often dwarfed by elaborately painted or sculptured backgrounds. While the ceiling is usually delicately painted or sculptured, now barrel-shaped, now somewhat flattened, walls are thicker than in the Gothic, bearing hidden within them the methods of construction inherited from Gothic. Pediments are of low pitch due to classical influence, or semicircular, often filled with sculpture. Openings in the wall are greatly restricted. Light is no longer absolutely free to stream in through the building. It is controlled, particularly in Baroque, and exploited to emphasize artistic detail. And domes are frequently used precisely to serve this contrived illumination, again, especially in Baroque. Summary. All the styles of church architecture developed throughout the past 1900 years have at least this in common, that is, they have endeavored, more or less perfectly, to bring out the idea that the church building is the dwelling place of God among men. Though this aim remains constant in all styles, what changes is man's idea of God and his relationship to mankind. This change, however, is more in emphasis than in fundamental beliefs. In the basilica, God's house takes the appearance of the house of the emperor, the pantocrator or ruler of all men. Christ is the new universal king. His victory over the enemy, the devil, and paganism is emphasized, and hence his mediatorship more than his divinity is the focal point of devotion. With the Romanesque church, God's house becomes a castle of the victorious warrior lord, with the faithful as his vassals. Just as the vassals of the earthly lord clustered about his castle to form a society, so the church and its members form a society, the civitas Dei, the kingdom of God on earth, and the mediatorship of Christ is still the point of emphasis. In the Gothic cathedral, we see the castle of the divine Lord, although the castle idea is now more refined and points directly towards heaven and God's infinity and divinity by means of the cathedral's stark vertical lines. God is far away here, though still present as the object of man's inquisitiveness, analysis, and contemplation. This is also the age of passion mysticism. It stresses Christ as the suffering God, and art depicts him displaying the trophies of his passion, his wounds, in the company of his heavenly followers, the saints and martyrs. Although the Renaissance church embodies the idea of the house of God, it may appear more like a monument of human fulfillment through natural means. Christ is depicted in its art more as a humanist hero, the great athlete. Baroque portrays God's hall of state on earth. The church is the hall of the real presence. The altar is his throne. Human fulfillment is certainly stressed, but fulfillment through God's power, and this is brought out in painting and sculpture. Man is glorified through Christ triumphant in heaven, who is the sensible, tangible, beautiful joy of the saints. When the religion culture of Baroque times fell, art echoed the spirit of those times. It became commercialized and fell into the snare of utopian romanticism, copying the past to cover up for its present hopeless lack of spark and initiative. It was the age of Catholic repository art, which, we are tempted to think, did not want to face the chaos of society or the challenge to Christianity. It was conservative art, afraid to step into the future. This, we feel, was a degradation of true art and a betrayal of genuine Catholic culture, which has as its mission to bring redemption to the world in which it finds itself, not to hide the mistakes and woes of mankind behind plaster and glass-eyed statuary. With modern times, a genuine art religion culture seems to be emerging from the so-called sweetness and so-called life-likeness of the sentimental conservative romanticist. Art and architecture are using the materials of their times to express the needs of their times. As man looks about him and sees the devastation that pockmarked his world through 2 terrible wars and foresees little security in the future, his confidence is shaken despite all his advances in technology. Having become a wanderer, for example, the refugees, and insecure, he is more aware than ever of the utter transitoriness of this earth and life. He cries for redemptive salvation. He sees God's earthly abode as a symbol of man's passing to better things. The church, more and more today, is coming to resemble the so-called tent of God, our Redeemer, with whom we are en voyage to the heavenly Jerusalem. Today, we are an ecclesia Today we are an ecclesia peregrinans. Modern trends. The church has never made any particular architectural style her own. She leaves the matter of style an open question for those who are responsible for the construction of a new church, so long as the creative talent of the artist and architect truly serve the purpose of worship. Church law simply states that the local ordinary, after seeking the advice of experts, should take care that the forms handed down by Christian tradition and the laws of sacred art be observed in the construction and restoration of churches. But traditional forms are not the same as styles of the past. As long as the church structure expresses the idea that it is the house of God and the house of prayer, and respects and promotes the liturgical worship of the church, it may be said to be faithful to tradition. The purposes of the church structure, arranged in order of importance, are 1. The celebration of Mass, 2. The partaking of the fruits of Christ's redeeming sacrifice by means of the sacraments, 3. The preaching of the Word of God, 4. The adoration of the presence of our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament, 5. The accomplishment of various public non-liturgical devotions, 6. The exercise of purely private devotions on the part of individual Catholics. An architect has as his primary duty to find material solutions which will satisfy these ends according to their respective importance. If we are to be faithful to this hierarchy of purposes, the ground plan of the interior church should be determined chiefly by the requirements of the Eucharistic sacrifice and not, as so often happens, primarily for the sake of devotion to the real presence, a purpose which requires spatial arrangements to be made chiefly to serve adoration and contemplation. Some may think that the ideal form of the church is circular, with the altar in the very middle of the congregation. This is a mistake. The holy sacrifice, for which the edifice is primarily intended, is, according to the rationale of the Roman liturgy, an action, the action of Christ, through his representative, the priest, evoking a response on the part of the faithful. This mutual collaboration is expressed during the Mass by the responses of the people to the greetings and prayers of the priest, as well as by the processions for the offertory and communion. This supposes a spatial arrangement directed towards the altar, so that there is an exchange of address and response between sanctuary and nave, between priest and people, and processional movements to and from the altar. An altar placed right in the midst of the congregation does not fit this purpose well, for when the priest addresses the congregation, there will always be some members of it behind him. Two distinct poles of activity are much more preferable. However, this does not mean that the altar should be placed at the far end of the sanctuary, a position which discourages active participation. To encourage participation and yet preserve the expression of hierarchical orderings supposed by the Mass, it would be well to place the altar at the point where the sanctuary and nave meet. Since the altar is the sacrificial banquet table of the people of God, it is incorrect to make it a mere wall appendage, as though its purpose were merely to serve as a pedestal for tabernacle, crucifix, candelabra, and reliquaries or elaborate backgrounds. The altar should stand out as a table and should have the greatest prominence as the most sacred object in the church, for it is the bearer of Christ's sacrifice. It should be the center and heart of the whole environment. To be this, it must be situated in an isolated but not distant spot. It must be relatively elevated. It must be well proportioned and well made in the given material. It must be monumental in relation to the size of the entire edifice. It must be situated in the right perspective at the point where there is the most light, and it must be surmounted by a baldachin or canopy. While canon law and recent decrees demand that the tabernacle as a rule be placed on the main altar, it also allows for exceptions to this rule. It is clearly in keeping with tradition that the altar versus populum of the basilica style be continued in our times. Pontifical documents recognize that there are sound reasons of pastoral import for this practice of celebrating Mass facing the people. Pius XII, though commanding respect for the canons which concern union of tabernacle and altar, expressed hope that specialists would devise some way of arranging the tabernacle that it will not hinder such a practice. Bugnini, a consultor of the Congregation of Rites, declares that this practice is a good reason for allowing an exception to the rule that the tabernacle must be regularly kept on the main altar, as mentioned in Canon 1268. Of course, there is only one altar. Of course, where there is only one altar, it cannot be built versus populum, for the tabernacle must be in the center of it. Hence, when this practice is desired and is approved by the local ordinary, it is recommended that a fitting altar be prepared, either behind the main altar or in a side chapel, to receive the tabernacle. Windows piercing the wall behind the altar, especially when the rays of sun will stream through them during Mass, and paintings on this same wall, which have no relation to the Eucharistic action, are to be discouraged, for they will serve only to distract those who assist at Mass. The architecture and decoration of the sanctuary should be so designed as to draw the eye to the altar. When paintings adorn the sanctuary walls, they should represent ideas taken from the canon of the Mass. They should be not historical events, but timeless motifs. And since the altar and sanctuary constitute the primary liturgical focus, the primary architectural focus should also be there. All the lines of the church should converge upon the altar. Whatever is secondary ought to be subordinated to it. Side altars, confessionals, stations of the cross, light fixtures, benches, and chairs. Indispensable items should be placed in a lower or side chapel, especially designed for private devotion, perhaps in a side chapel of the Blessed Sacrament if one is available. The sacristy ought to be located near the sanctuary in such a way as to permit a festive approach to the altar on feast days and to make it possible once again to execute the introit as a genuine entrance hymn. According to the liturgy, preaching, which is in organic relation to the Eucharistic sacrifice, should be primarily an extension and explanation of the Word of God proclaimed in the Mass, of the catechumens, preaching centered on the epistle and gospel, therefore. Like the epistle and gospel, the sermon should normally issue forth from the sanctuary and not from a pulpit located in the middle of the church. Thus, the sermon's intimate connection with the liturgical action would be brought out. The function of the choir, or schola cantorum, is to lead the congregation in prayers and hymns and the regular liturgical acclamations, to alternate with the congregation in the responsorial chants, and to represent the congregation now and then. In accordance with its function, it should be located at the forward end of the congregation and next to the sanctuary, possibly in a slightly sunken section immediately before the altar. It is unfortunate when the choir is located in a high gallery in the rear of the church, and then it loses contact with the congregation, and its chances of leading it are lessened. The organ console might also be better placed towards the front of the congregation near the schola, for its function is to sustain both choir and people in their singing, not to furnish solo pieces during the misnamed so-called pauses of the Mass. The liturgical office of the choir members is often enhanced by their use of cassock and surplice. A second liturgical focus is the place for the administration of the sacraments of baptism and penance. To bring out their role as a gateway to the Eucharist, as a purification before entering the church, a special structure or room for administering them might stand at the opposite end of the edifice from the sanctuary. In the early church, circular or octagonal baptisteries were preferred. The baptismal font itself could be sunken below the level of the floor so that the candidate would have to descend a short flight of steps to reach it. This would bring out the Pauline theology of baptism as burial with Christ and rising to a new life through his grace. Since penance also plays the role of a second baptism, confessionals would appropriately fit into the theme of this baptismal so-called chapel. Finally, it is a mistake to entrust the building and decoration of the church to one man alone, the pastor, or to the whims of a generous donor. The sacred edifice, by its very nature, must suit the needs of the community as a whole, reflect its character, but most important of all, must meet strictly and perfectly the laws and spirit of the sacred liturgy. Hence, a diocesan commission made up of experts both in art and liturology, men genuinely competent in their fields, ought to be entrusted with such a sacred and serious responsibility. The responsibility for producing for the Christian community an edifice intended as its heavenly home here below, a home to be loved and cherished, a home wherein the minds and hearts of its members shall be fed the solid meat of the supernatural life, wherein precious souls shall be born unto God, warmed with his love, inspired toward perfection, led to the maturity of likeness to the image of Christ. Church law. It would be well if, at this point, we summarize the official legislation of the church contained in canons 1162 to 1178. No church may be built without the written consent of the local ordinary, and such permission should not be granted unless he prudently foresees that the material means necessary for its construction will not be wanting. An obligation also rests with the ordinary to see to it, after having heard the advice of experts if need be, that Christian tradition and the rules of sacred art be faithfully observed in the construction of the edifice. No opening may be made from the church to the homes of laymen. If there are any rooms above or below the church, they must not be used for merely profane purposes. Respected canonists hold that this clearly forbids the holding of dances, banquets, dramatic performances, except of a religious nature, or secular meetings in such areas, and that the space above a church must not be used as a bedroom. However, authors permit the use of such areas for religious libraries, lecture classes, and meetings of parochial societies. Divine services may not be conducted in a new church until it has been dedicated either through solemn consecration or at least through blessing. However, the needs of the faithful cannot always wait, and the bishop may permit the celebration of Mass in an uncompleted church or in some other provisional hall as long as it is fitting and clean place. As long as it is a fitting and clean place. This can be done only for a limited time. Should the emergency perdure, the ordinary should request a special indult. If once the ordinary has given his consent for the construction of a church, it becomes evident that the building will have to be given over to profane uses, he should neither consecrate it nor bless it. Cathedral churches are to be solemnly consecrated and, as far as possible, collegiate, conventual, and parochial churches also. While churches built of wood or metal may not be consecrated but only blessed, those built of stone, brick, or reinforced concrete may be consecrated, provided that in the latter case the places for the 12 crosses and the doorposts of the main entrance be of stone. Though an altar may be consecrated at any time apart from the consecration of the church, no church may be consecrated unless at least one altar be also dedicated at the same time. Every consecrated or blessed church must have its proper title, which cannot be changed after the dedication. A church may not be dedicated to the blessed, that is, those not yet canonized, without a special apostolic indult. It is fitting that every church be equipped with bells with which to summon the faithful to liturgical worship and other religious exigencies. They must be consecrated or at least blessed, and they may not be used for profane purposes without necessity, nor without the permission of the ordinary or the allowance of legitimate custom. The church and its contents are to be kept clean as befits the house of God. Furthermore, business transactions and public sales must not take place in church, even though the sales are for pious purpose. Anything that is not in harmony with the sacredness of the place is to be avoided. 2. The altar. The most sacred object in the church is the altar, for it is the point where heaven and earth meet, the so-called Holy of Holies in which the manifestation of God takes place. A second Calvary where the Son of God renews his salvific sacrifice and in so doing becomes present and offers himself to man as nourishment for his soul. The altar from earliest times came to be regarded as a symbol of Christ. Even now the same honors are paid to it as to Christ. It is kissed, incensed, bowed to, and all this apart from any consideration of the tabernacle. Historical development of the altar. At first, the Christian sacrifice was offered as a common supper. At first, the Christian sacrifice was offered at a common supper table. It was in the context of the Passover meal that our Lord instituted the sacrifice. The same held true of the apostolic and sub-apostolic era, for there were no churches but only the homes of Christians in which the Mass could be offered. In fact, to the celebration of the Mass proper was added the meal of Holy Fellowship, the agape, at which the same table was used. Little wonder, then, that the early Christians called the altar the table of the Lord, mensa dominica. It is in this context that we must understand the accusation often made by pagans against the Christians that the latter had no altars. Minucius Felix openly admitted this. He, of course, uses the word aura, which in antiquity referred to the altars used in the cult of the dead and in general of the pagan gods. Because of this connection, Christians refused to use the term for divine worship, but gradually accepted the word altare, for even in the pagan mind, such an object was reserved for the worship of the superior gods. And so, in the primitive church, since Christians used the homes of private citizens for the Mass and often united the Eucharist with the agape, the form of altar used was an ordinary table. In the Roman house, as we saw, there was always available a table or cartabulum, a tribadion or three-legged table was also used. Hence, the altar was a simple portable table, usually of wood, moved into place only for the sacrificial part of the Mass. Stone and metal altars began to appear in the time of Constantine, more quickly in the East, 4th century, than in the West, 6th century. Once the fear of persecution passed and the church enjoyed a legal existence, regular houses of worship, specially built for the purpose, became more common, and with them altars of heavy material fixed to the ground. But even in this period, when stone and metal began to be used, altars remained faithful to the table-like form. From the time of Constantine at the very latest, we find the altar surmounted by a baldachin or ciborium on 4 columns. Authors interpret this phenomenon differently. Edmund Bishop sees here an example of the tendency of the ancients to veil sacred objects, and Noël Boulay concurs in this opinion. Lechner and Eisenhofer say that the custom may have been taken over from the Byzantine court, where the throne of the emperor was sheltered by such a structure. However, they refer to the opinion of A. Heisenberg as also probable. According to him, the Christian world followed as a model the superstructure built over the Lord's sepulchre in the Church of the Resurrection at Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, the word ciborium comes from the Semitic term for grave, Syriac kebora, Hebrew keber, and even Greek kiboruin. And as late as the 6th century, we find given to this structure in St. Peter's Basilica the name Ciborium Sepulchri. But P. Anson seems to prefer the opinion that the ciborium comes from the Byzantine court arrangement, since it resembles so closely the tegurium, which stood over both the chief magistrate's seat in the civil basilicas and those structures which enshrined the statues of the Roman deities. However, since the word tegorium is simply a corrupted form of ciborium, there does not seem to be much difference between these opinions. Until this time, the altar in Rome, and to a large extent in the remainder of the West, was always arranged so that the celebrant faced the people during Mass. Okay. Due to Eastern influence, the principle of orientation at prayers came into vogue during the 6th and 7th centuries, particularly in Gaul. Africa vacillated between Roman and Oriental practice. Thus, churches were built with the apse at the east end, and the celebrant, in order to face the east during Mass, assumed his place on the people's side of the altar with his back to them. The cult of the martyrs also greatly added to the evolution of the Christian altar. Our present practice of burying the relics of martyrs in the altar table goes back not to the imagined necessity during the times of persecution of celebrating the Eucharist in the catacombs over the graves of martyrs, but rather to the post-Constantine effort to honor the martyrs by building churches near, or if at all possible, directly over the graves of martyrs. St. Peter's Basilica is one of the first examples of this practice. To satisfy the desire of the faithful to venerate the remains of those who fought for Christ, the so-called Ferenstrella Confessiones, small openings of marble or metal lattice work, were constructed beneath the altar, later in the sides of the altar, and on the sides of the area containing the tomb. Thus, the people were able to see the burial place and even insert objects of devotion and touch them to the tomb of the martyr. When it became necessary to remove the bodies of martyrs from the catacombs to avoid the danger of their being desecrated by invading marauders, special crypts were often constructed behind the altar and beneath the sanctuary floor to receive them. As a later development, we find such relics interred within the altar itself. These solutions were thought satisfactory in the Middle Ages, and thus the shape of the altar, a table or cube shape, was not interfered with. But the piety of certain localities did not find this sufficient. Soon we see the bodies of saints placed on the altar table, in just the same spot where today the tabernacle rests. In order to make up for space lost through this innovation, the altar table, hitherto almost square, now became oblong. The altar thus acquired a front and back, and another reason was at hand for the priest celebrating Mass on the front of the people's side of it. Shrines built to house the relics of saints, placed on top of the altar, gradually increased to such size that the ciborium had to be done away with. Since admission to the sanctuary was normally forbidden to the laity, and their desire to get close to the relics was always strong, architects of the later Middle Ages found a solution for this dilemma by creating deambulatories that went around the sanctuary, and by placing the altar near or against the back wall of the sanctuary. This unfortunately took the altar further away from the congregation assisting at Mass. Understandably, the small and poor churches were not always able to obtain the body of a saint or the major portion of a saint's relics. This did not prevent them from imitating their so-called betters. Shrines could still be built over the altar to house statues or pictures of the saints. As devotion to individual martyrs and saints grew rapidly, special altars were erected here and there in the church to honor them, and this pious tendency, together with the desire on the part of the priests to celebrate privately, gave rise to a multiplicity of altars in the same church. The advent of the Renaissance and Baroque periods only served to emphasize the shrine built on the altar. The superstructure became higher and higher, and the altar, when not lost in the maze of decoration, assumed the form of a sarcophagus, whether it actually enclosed a saint's body or not. This whole process of development comes to a close with the union of tabernacle and altar. Though there were already scattered instances of the tabernacle being placed on the altar from the 10th century on in England and France, it was not until the 16th century that the practice became a general custom. This more modern usage can be traced back to the novel idea of Matteo Ghiberti, Bishop of Verona, 1524 to 1543, who, in order to enkindle the devotion of his clergy and people towards the Blessed Sacrament, had a tremendous tabernacle made of marble and crystal and borne by 4 brass angels suspended above the main altar of his cathedral. Other bishops followed suit, but the practice of placing the tabernacle on the altar did not actually become required until the Roman ritual of Paul V in 1614 made it obligatory for all the churches of Rome and recommended its adoption by all other dioceses. It was left to Baroque and Rococo to make the whole altar subservient to this so-called house of God, often turning the already monstrous superstructure or retable into a radiant monstrance for the Blessed Sacrament. Today, of course, the union of the tabernacle and altar is required by universal church law, but it is a healthy sign of return to a more balanced view of the relationship of sacrifice and sacrament when modern architects reduce the size of the tabernacle, eliminate the gigantic rear superstructure, and emphasize the altar as a table of sacrifice. Church law. The fundamental law concerning the altar is to be found in the Missale Romanum. The altar, on which the most holy sacrifice of the Mass is to be celebrated, should be of stone and consecrated by a bishop or an abbot having faculties from the Apostolic See, or at least there should be a stone insertion large enough to support the host and the greater part of the base of the chalice, and it should be likewise consecrated as above. This altar should be covered with 3 cloths or clean coverings, blessed by a bishop or some other person having authority, the upper cloth being at least long enough to reach to the ground at the end sides of the altar, the other 2 cloths shorter or consisting of 1 folded cloth. It should be adorned with a frontal of color suitable to the feast or office, insofar as it is possible. On the altar should be placed a crucifix. In the middle, and at least 2 candlesticks with lighted candles on either side. At the foot of the cross should be placed the altar card. On the epistle corner, there should be a cushion for the support of the Missal, and at the same side, the wax candle to be lighted at the elevation of the sacrament, a small bell, glass cruets for wine and water, together with a small dish, and a clean towel should be prepared in a niche or small table near the epistle corner of the altar. On the altar, nothing whatsoever should be placed which does not appertain to the sacrifice of the Mass or to the adornment of the altar itself. There are 2 kinds of altar according to canon law. 1, a fixed or immovable one, which consists of a table, mensa, and legs, stipites. These 2 parts are consecrated as one whole. The other kind of altar is a portable one, which consists of a stone, generally of small proportions, which alone is consecrated, or the same stone with its support, which is not consecrated. The Congregation of Rites seems to refer to a 3rd type of altar, ad modum fixi. It consists of a consecrated altar stone, portable altar, inserted into the top of an altar made of solid and more or less permanent material, brick or stone. There must be at least 1 fixed altar in a consecrated church, and it must be consecrated at the same time as the church. The table of the fixed altar, or the altar stone of a portable altar, must be of a single natural stone, integral and unbreakable, comparatively durable, for example, marble, granite, limestone, slate, sandstone, or schist. This would certainly seem to exclude any artificial stone, for example, brick, pumice, concrete, and gypsum. This tabletop made of natural integral stone must extend over the whole top of the altar and be firmly attached to the support or legs, so that the priest will not mar the bottom of the altar front should it be a cube. It is recommended that the tabletop extend about 2 inches beyond the front support. Um, also, with respect of, so there's a note, again, this is relevant to current controversies. This is a note with respect of, there are 2 kinds of altar according to canon law: a fixed or immovable one, which consists of a table, mensa, and legs. And this, a note on this. Hence, when the Holy Father Pius XII says that one would be straying from the straight path were he to wish the altar restored to its primitive table form, Mediator Dei, paragraph 62, he cannot be interpreting as forbidding the building of the altar in the form of a table, for thus it is defined in canon law. Rather, he is against the use of an ordinary dinner table, which certainly would not comply with all the regulations set down in law concerning the altar. The word primitive indicates this. The supports or legs can be of any form as long as they are the same material as the mensa. The support may be one solid block of stone extending under the entire mensa, or one large stone block just under the middle of the mensa, or 4 more supports placed under the corners and elsewhere under the mensa. In the consecration of an immovable altar, the mensa is ritually joined to the supports by means of 4 anointings. The place between the supports may be filled with brick, stone, or cement, or may be left open. Though the body of a saint may be placed in this open space, the Congregation of Rites forbids such a space to be used for storage. In the spirit of this legislation, and to preserve the sanctity of the altar, one should not place a crib below the mensa. Anything placed below or above the mensa, which has nothing to do with the celebration of the Mass or the simple adornment of the altar, detracts from the altar's primary purpose and therefore ought to be avoided. Also necessary for the consecration of an immovable altar is what is called a sepulchre, a small cavity, square or oblong in the top of the mensa, in which relics of the saints are placed. This is to be covered by a single piece of stone of the same material as the mensa, which is cemented in place during the consecration ceremony. For the validity of the consecration, it is sufficient to place within the sepulchre the relics of one martyr and of another saint. The relics are to be placed in a reliquary of lead, gold, or silver. This is tied with a ribbon and sealed after the insertion of 3 grains of incense and a certificate concerning the consecration of the altar. Since during the consecration of the altar, the bishop must walk around it 7 times, incensing it, it should stand free of the back wall. As for its measurements, nothing is prescribed, but experience suggests that it be from the 3 feet to 3 inches to 3 feet 6 inches high. A good length, allowing 3 distinct positions for the celebrant in a regular parish church, would be about 7 feet 6 inches. If there is a tabernacle on the altar, mensa, a minimum width for the latter would be appropriately 4 feet. According to the Congregation of Rites, there must be at least 1 step in front of the altar called the predelia or suppundeum. It ought to have breadth enough to allow for the priest to genuflect without his right foot falling off it. Hence, about 3 feet 9 inches. To give the main altar dignity, 2 more steps might be added, for the deacon and subdeacon in a solemn mass are supposed to stand on different levels. An altar loses its consecration if the table becomes separated even for a moment from its support. This does not necessarily mean that the altar cannot be moved. It may be, as long as the union of mensa and supports is not interrupted. A considerable break in any part of the altar, or at the points of anointing, the removal of the relics from the sepulchre, or the removal or breaking of its cover, except with the authorization of the bishop, will bring about a loss of consecration. It must always be remembered that the altar is the most sacred object in the church. Great reverence should be shown to it. Those who must clean it, prepare it, or otherwise adorn it should always act in a becoming manner. They should not lean on it, nor place anything on it which does not belong there. 3. Altar accessories. Tabernacle. In the early church, the Blessed Sacrament was not reserved in the church except for the sake of the sick, and then it was usually kept in an appropriate place in the sacristy. A small cabinet in the wall beside a small cabinet in the wall beside the altar. That's a typo or something. A small cabinet in the wall beside the altar served this purpose in the early Middle Ages. In France and England, it became customary to reserve the Blessed Sacrament in a pyx resembling a dove, and to hang this above the altar, while in Germany niches were cut into the walls for it. In richer churches, a highly decorated house or tower was built. Already in the 10th century, we began to find ecclesiastical decrees requiring that the pyx containing the Blessed Sacrament be placed on the altar. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council insisted that the pyx be locked. In 1614, the Roman ritual made it obligatory on all churches of Rome to keep the sacred species in a regular tabernacle on the altar. Finally, the Code of Canon Law extended this obligation to the entire church. Although the Roman ritual enjoined the use of a tabernacle veil, observance of this rule was more or less limited to Italy until the Congregation of Rites in 1866 made it an obligation for all. The Blessed Sacrament may habitually be reserved only in one altar in the church, and it must be kept in a tabernacle that is immovable and placed in the middle of an altar, never anywhere else. Canon Law wants the tabernacle with the Blessed Sacrament to occupy a very excellent and noble place in the church, and states that it should normally be kept on the main altar, unless some other altar is considered more convenient and fitting. The Code actually mentions some instances in which it would be better to reserve the Blessed Sacrament on an altar other than the main one, in cathedrals, collegiate, and conventual churches. And the reason it gives for this preference is noteworthy, namely that the Blessed Sacrament will not interfere with or hinder the sacred functions. And Pius XII, in his allocution to the Assisi Congress for Pastoral Liturgy, used the same reasoning when he spoke of devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. He hoped that specialists would devise some way of arranging the tabernacle so that it would not hinder the celebration of Mass facing the people. A. Bugnini, a consultor of the Congregation of Rites, does not hesitate to say that where there is a desire to celebrate Mass facing the people, the tabernacle may be transferred to another altar, as long as the altar is suitable for such a purpose. Thus, it is recommended that in such a case, a special Blessed Sacrament chapel be built, or another altar be erected behind and slightly higher than the main altar, and furnished with an appropriately decorated tabernacle. This latter arrangement would seem preferable because it keeps the Blessed Sacrament in a centralized position, and therefore is in accord with canon law's direction that the Blessed Sacrament be given a very excellent and noble place in the church. Where, however, only one altar is found in a church, it may not be versus populum, for the tabernacle with the Blessed Sacrament must be placed on and in the middle of the altar. The tabernacle must be well made and safely locked. Any strong material may be used, but not transparent crystal. And if wood is used, it should be appropriately decorated. It must be covered with a veil. No special type of cloth is indicated. It may be either white or correspond to the liturgical colors, the latter procedure being preferred. Violet, however, must be used for requiem masses. In order to veil the tabernacle properly on all sides, it should not be built into the gradients if there be such. It should also be remembered that some sort of canopy is required over the Blessed Sacrament altar. This canopy may take various forms. It may, for example, be a ciborium, that is to say, a solid structure of stone, marble, metal, or wood supported over the altar by 4 or more columns. It might take the form of a baldachin or smaller canopy of metal, wood, or cloth supported over the altar and predella by 2 columns at the rear of the altar or 2 chains at the rear of the wall, or it may be what is called a tester or a canopy, usually made of wood or cloth, suspended directly from the ceiling. A lamp burning day and night before the Blessed Sacrament is also prescribed. It may be placed anywhere in the sanctuary. Before does not necessarily mean immediately in front of the tabernacle door. The substance to be burned is either olive oil, beeswax, or some other vegetable oil. No special color is prescribed for the lamp. Altar cloths and antepedium. In early times, the altar was covered only during Mass and was stripped afterwards. This covering originally reached to the bottom of the altar on all 4 sides. Its reduction to a strip of cloth stretching only over the top and down the 2 sides may find a possible explanation in the impossibility of covering the whole altar when it was placed against the back wall. However, P. Anson suggests that the change was due rather to the fact that it was awkward to cover the whole structure with one large piece of cloth, since large cumbersome folds resulted at each corner. At any rate, when this cloth came to be situated to the top and 2 sides, reverence to the altar as a symbol of Christ led many to decorate the altar front with silk or some other rich cloth, and sometimes with carved wood or precious metals. This was the beginning of the antepedium or frontal, which in later times was changed according to the liturgical colors. From the Renaissance period on, when altars were so highly decorated, such frontals began to disappear. The rubrics of the Roman Missal still require that the altar be adorned with an antepedium, which, as far as possible, should change according to the color of the liturgical office. No particular material is indicated. Modern rubricians are inclined to dispense from this law whenever the front side of the altar is of precious or ornate quality. Though no church law makes this distinction, custom would seem to countenance it. The altar must also be covered with 3 altar cloths, and according to the Congregation of Rites, these must be made of linen or hemp. No other material may be used. Crucifix and candles. Both of these items are comparatively modern additions to the aperturances of the altar. Originally, neither stood on the altar itself. Only the oblation and the Missal were placed there. In the 7th century, we find that 7 candles were carried before the bishop as he entered the church. They were then placed on the pavement around the altar. This custom was taken over from the practice of the Roman imperial curia, where persons of high rank were so honored. Evidence for the candles being placed on the altar mensa dates from the 11th and 12th centuries. Innocent III says that the Rome of his day observed the custom of having 2 candles only on the altar for papal masses. From a study of documents of this period, Edmund Bishop concludes that a change from 2 to 7 candles on the altar was made between the years 1198 and 1254. This same number of candles is still required for a pontifical high mass, but on the altar, where solemn functions take place, only 6 are needed, and at least 2 must be used for an ordinary low mass. Long before the cross took its place upon the altar table, there hung a cross from the ceiling of the church, usually between the apse and the nave. Sometimes it was simply a cross without the image of the crucified. Sometimes it was covered with gems, the crux gemeta. Often, after Christians began to depict the Savior nailed to the cross, his image was vested in regal or priestly robes, and a crown of jewels was placed on his head. It was relatively late that the suffering of the Savior were brought out in all their striking realism. This was done about the 13th century, the age of the Passion mystics. At the end of the 12th century, we hear of the processional cross being placed against the altar once the bishop's procession had wound its way to the sanctuary. A little later, we are finally told that it was a regular thing to place a cross on the altar between 2 candles. The first time there's a mention of an obligation to have a crucifix on the altar is in the Roman Missal of Pius V in 1570. This is still required, but it does not mean that the crucifix cannot hang above the altar. All rubricians recognize the validity of such an arrangement. In fact, a hanging crucifix is much more desirable for an altar versus populum. It does not get in the way of the people's vision, and it would seem more fitting that in such a case, the corpus be on the people's side. There is no law concerning which direction it should face. The rubrics of Mass simply state that the celebrant should bow to the cross. When the other rubrics say that the celebrant is to glance upward toward heaven, that is to say, towards the cross, this is only an indication of about how high he should raise his head. After the appearance of the encyclical Mediator Dei, some have thought that the so-called Christ the King crucifix was forbidden, since the Pope says that one would be straying from the straight path were he to, etc., order the crucifix so designed that the divine Redeemer's body shows no trace of his cruel sufferings. But as long as such a crucifix allows the wounds in the hands and feet to be visible, it is still in accord with the Pope's wishes. Secondary elements. Altar cards came into use in the 16th century in order to assist the priest's memory. Pius V ordered that there should be a card in the middle of the altar containing certain formulas recited there. The use of two other cards, one at each end of the altar, began to spread in the course of the 17th century. Normally, a priest should have all these prayers memorized. Nevertheless, the rubrics prescribe the center card. If the altar is so built that the priest can face the congregation as he celebrates Mass, this card or cards ought to be small enough to lie flat on the altar table and not interfere with the view of the people. At the same time, they should be practical, clear, legible, not smothered with decorative borders and frames. A source of much abuse in churches is the use of flowers to decorate the altar. Before 1600, there was no official law concerning them. Before this time, it was custom to hang garlands on the walls and columns of the churches, and if cut flowers were employed, to place them on the floor around the altar. In 1600, however, the Ceremonial Episcoporum permitted the placing of flowers on the altar itself, but here restraint and good taste must be employed. One should be careful not to make the altar just an occasion for arranging floral displays. And if the priest celebrates facing the people, the presence of anything on the altar except very low candles will defeat the purpose of this procedure. Large churches seem to warrant the use of microphones on the altar in order to make what the priest says there sufficiently understandable in the rear of the church. They ought, however, to be small and unobtrusive, perhaps even buried in the top of the altar. Church furnishings. Communion rail. The sanctuary today is usually separated from the nave by means of a communion rail. Some maintain that this is a compromise between the medieval rood screen, which not only separated sanctuary from nave, but completely cut off the people's view of the altar, and the long wall which enclosed the choir in the Roman basilicas. But the rood screen was a late medieval exaggeration, comparable to the Oriental iconostasis. The communion rail, more probably, is derived from the enclosure for the choir or the low entablature of the pergola, which, when the enclosure was lacking, separated the sanctuary from the people in the Roman basilicas. Neither the enclosure, which was high enough to conceal the singers, nor the low entablature of the pergola ever obstructed the view of the altar. The pergola, in all appearances, was simply intended to mark off the space for the clerics. The communion rail, while demarcating the sacred area of the church, also serves a higher purpose. It is an extension of the altar, the table of the Lord, since here the people enjoy the closest possible participation in the holy sacrifice by receiving Holy Communion, the fruit of that sacrifice. To emphasize this fact, some have broadened the top of this rail so that it has taken on more of the appearance of a narrow table. It seems ideal to construct the rail in such a way that it resembles somewhat the altar, same material, style, decoration. In keeping with its sacred function, the communion rail must be covered with a clean white cloth during the distribution of communion. Pulpit. The word pulpit comes from the Latin pulpitum, a tribune or platform. The German uses the word Kanzel, which is derived from cancellii, the enclosure for the choir in the early Roman basilicas, where the ambos were built for the singing of the epistle and gospel. In French, the word is chaire, a seat, a usage that goes back to the time when the bishop addressed the faithful from his throne at the head of the apse. In early times, when a bishop celebrated Mass, he would preach from his throne. But when an ordinary priest celebrated in the absence of pope or bishop, he would not dare preach from the episcopal throne. Rather, he spoke from the ambo built in the cancelli. With the advent of the mendicant orders, pulpits were built out in the nave amid the faithful. It was at this very time that a separation of the sermon from the theme of the Mass occurred. Before then, the sermon was a homily or commentary on the scripture readings of the Mass. At first, the pulpit was a movable platform, while in the 15th century, it was attached or built as part of a column or the wall of the nave. At the same time, in order to favor acoustics, the shell-shaped canopy was placed above and to the rear of the preacher. Actually, there is no law governing the pulpit. However, with the ever-increasing insistence on the homily type of sermon, that is, one which continues the proclamation of the Word of God by explaining what is read in the lessons of the Mass, it is advisable to have some sort of lectern or small pulpit as part of the sanctuary in order to bring out the connection between the sermon and the Mass action. Care should be taken that the pulpit is not of a size to block the people's view of the altar. Confessional. Public confession of sin was a rare thing even in the early church. Though the absolution or reconciliation, as it was then called, was given in public, the penitent confessed his sins in private, usually in the residence of the bishop or priest. Because of the obvious dangers of hearing confessions in private dwellings, bishops insisted from the 11th century on that they be heard in the church itself. The priest sat in the open church, either in the sanctuary or a more private part of the church, and the penitent knelt beside him. After the penitent had accused himself, the priest would then pronounce sentence, give a penance, impose his hand upon him, and give absolution. Only in the course of the 17th century was a grill introduced, probably due to the prescriptions laid down by St. Charles Borromeo for his own diocese of Milan in 1565. These prescriptions were taken over by the Roman ritual in 1614. And present canon law insists that confessions of women be heard in an open and conspicuous place, in a public or semi-public oratory at least, and that all confessionals have an immovable screen separating priest and penitent. For Jerome and Tertullian, the sacrament of penance was like a second baptism, secunda post naufragentium tablua. It was a second chance, a readmission of the sinner to the sacramental life of the church. Others called it a baptismus laboriosus. This function of penance as a second baptism could be well brought out by placing the confessionals in the baptistery, or at least in a special penance chapel near the baptistery. Thus, both sacraments should regain in the consciousness of the faithful the place and significance they should have as the means of purification before being admitted to the table of the Lord, the gateway to the other sacraments. Lustral water stoups. Rigetti connects the use of blessed water from the stoups, which contain it, at the entrance of the churches, to the practice of sprinkling the faithful during the Sunday asperges. Since the custom of the faithful taking the water upon entrance of the church certainly antedates the introduction of the asperges, another opinion sees the origin of the blessed water and its containers in the early Latin basilicas cantharus, or fountain, at which the faithful were wont to wash themselves before entering the church, and in the impluvium of the Roman house, when the atrium ceased to be part of the church's structure. Such foundations were replaced by smaller vessels and put inside the church. Two early documents allude to the practice by the faithful of using lustral water at the entrance of the church. The 5th century church historian Sozomen reports an incident in which Valentinian, a captain of the Emperor Julian's guards, became violently angry when some of the lustra water sprinkled by the priest on him and his entourage as they entered the church fell upon his garments. And Synesius, also of the 5th century, claims that the lustral water placed at the entrance of the Christian temples can do more good than the sword of the civil authorities. Hence, the second opinion above seems more probable. Sacred vessels. Since the ritual cups used by the Jews in the time of Augustus were made of glass, it is conjectured that our Lord himself used one of this sort during the Last Supper. The chalices used by the early Christians were also of glass, but silver and gold ones were also common. The oldest chalices known to have existed had small handles on either side of the cup. In the Gothic period, the height of chalices was increased, while the Baroque and Rococo eras, the cup was transformed until it took on the appearance of a fully opened tulip, and lavish decorations were added to the base and stem. The paten, originally, was like a large platter. It had to be, for the celebrant broke the consecrated bread upon it for distribution in communion. The dish referred in the account of the Last Supper was very likely the forerunner of the paten. According to present legislation, the cup of the chalice must be of gold or silver, and if the latter, at least the inside of the cup must be gold-plated. The paten must also be of gold or silver, or at least the upper surface gold-plated. These vessels must be consecrated by someone having faculties for this. At first, the paten was used for the distribution of communion unless a silk bag took its place. Today, we use a ciborium shaped very much like a chalice. It came into use about the 13th century. The chalice veil became universal in the church through prescriptions laid down by Pius V in the Roman Missal. It takes its origin from the panus offertorius, which, out of reverence, was used to cover the chalice while it rested on the altar and to cover the priest's hand when he raised or otherwise touched the chalice during Mass. To satisfy the people's growing desire to see the Blessed Sacrament, Eucharistic processions were often held in the late Middle Ages. Some vessels were needed to carry the sacred species in such a way that they could easily be seen by the faithful. Thus, in the 14th century, we see the beginnings of the monstrance, or ostentorium, from the Latin monstrare, ostendere, meaning to show. At first, it was made like a cylindrical glass reliquary. In the 16th century, it took on the flat ray-like shape that it still has today. Vestments. In spite of the attempt of some medieval writers to see in the liturgical prescriptions of the Old Testament the origin of our liturgical vestments, history very emphatically forces us to trace the derivation of these vestments from the ancient Greco-Roman civil dress. Dionysius Exiguus gives evidence that in 530, there was no difference between liturgical and lay dress. From John the Deacon, biographer of Gregory the Great, we learn that during Gregory's lifetime, he had frescoes of himself and his father painted for the benefit of his monks. From John's description, we can see that the only distinction between the dress of father and son is the pallium worn by Gregory. Finally, the pictures in the catacombs and ancient churches speak the same language. No distinction is indicated between the dress of the celebrant and that of the ordinary Christians standing about the altar. Gradually, out of reverence, clerics were led to revere their finer apparel for use in the liturgy. Gradually, out of reverence, clerics were led to reserve their final apparel for. Gradually, out of reverence, clerics were led to reserve their finer apparel for use in the liturgy. The author of the Liber Pontificalis states that Pope Stephen, in the 3rd century, decreed that clerics should not use their liturgical vestments outside the church. But this may simply not be a reflection of practice true only of the author's own day, the 6th century. As a matter of fact, it is about this same time that we notice similar decrees being made in various places. The Council of Narbonne in 589 warned deacons and lectors not to remove the alb until Mass was finished. While the Roman civil dress was already changing under the influence of style in the 4th and 5th centuries, the Church retained the use of the traditional garments. Thus began the slow process which led to a difference between liturgical and street dress, not only in the costliness and beauty of fabric, but also in the very cut and number of garments worn. The Carolingian period brought a further development in that the form and purpose of the multiple vestments became determined not so much by reason of clear-cut ecclesiastical laws, which were few, but through custom. The 12th century fixed the liturgical colors, while the 13th century began to cut down the size of the chasuble. The Baroque period pushed this process to an extreme until the chasuble no longer resembled a genuine garment. Although originally there was no particular difference in color specified for the various feasts of the church, the chasuble was normally dark and the dalmatic bright. However, the Romans were noted for wearing white togas on special occasions. This might easily have influenced the primitive church in selecting white, the natural color of linen, as the predominant color of her vestments, though other colors were not unknown. The first traces of the tendency to set down rules concerning liturgical colors is found in the 9th century, a tendency which ends in specific prescriptions, at least as far as Rome is concerned, in the 12th century. 5 colors are accepted: white, red, green, violet, and black. A Missal of Naples dating from the 13th century mentions the use of rose. In other localities, still other colors were used. The Missal of Pius V in 1570 prescribed uniformity in the use of rose and the 5 colors mentioned by Innocent III. The use of gold vestments in place of white, red, and green was finally allowed in 1868 by the Congregation of Rites. Since the liturgical vestments were originally the actual attire worn by Roman citizens, it is rather difficult to see any grounds for giving the vestments a dogmatic or figurative meaning. Attempts to do so could only have arisen once the everyday clothing of the men in the streets had departed definitively from the styles of the early centuries. Writers who were not acquainted with the vestments' true origin explained them by reference to the Old Testament, liturgical apparel, or by pure allegory. And the prayers in use today for vesting before Mass spring straight from the pen of medieval allegorists. These prayers make their appearance in the 9th century and become general in the 11th and 12th centuries. The amice, the origin of the amice is still obscure. Some authors maintain that it appears as a liturgical vestment for the first time in the 9th century in the Frankish kingdom as a simple scarf for the neck, but it was most certainly used in Rome by at least the beginning of the 8th century. Righetti claims that its origin is to be found in an oblong piece of material falling over the shoulders from the neck in 2 parts and passing under the arms, the purpose of which was to hold the clothing close to the body and thus render the movement of arms unencumbered. As a matter of fact, Cassian, who wrote in the early part of the 5th century, reports that the monks in Egypt wore such a garment, and he calls it the amactum, or in Greek, the anabolos. In the Ordo Romanus and the Ordo Romanus Primus indicates that the pontiff placed the amice anagolium over the alb. Even today, this is still the custom in the Ambrosian rite. In the Frankish kingdom, however, the amice always appears as the first garment. This practice gradually became almost universal. In the 9th century, the amice began to be worn in another way, over the head as a hood, being thrown back over the shoulders only after all the vestments have been put on. It was worn this way universally in the West around the 13th century, and all those religious orders which came into existence during this period maintain the custom even today: the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Trinitarians, and the Servites. Since the amice thus thrown back did not always make for a neat appearance, a small strip of stiff ornate material was attached to its top edge. This was called an auri frisium, and gave to the amice, when thrown over the back, the appearance of a cowl. While disappearing generally once the Roman Missal was promulgated by Pius V, it is still used today in the Ambrosian rite. The alb. This vestment is simply the Greco-Roman tunica talaris, an indispensable garment of daily use, reaching to the feet and worn by everyone. It was called tunica alba because of its color, though linea or tunica linea seems to have been the earlier Roman name for it, since it was normally made of linen. In the Middle Ages, bands of colored material were sewn about the bottom and on the extremities of the sleeves. Sometimes this decoration appeared in the form of square pieces sewn on the back and front of the bottom. In the 17th century, lace was introduced. Out of this long flowing gown came the surplice, not quite as long as the alb, and having wide, long sleeves. The surplice was used already in the 11th century as a choir dress. In the 14th century, all clerics used it for services which did not require the alb. The Roman cotto with sleeves reaching only to the elbows is a later development. The roquette, from the German rock, coat, also comes from the alb, but has tight sleeves and is used by prelates when they assist at liturgical functions. The cincture is an obvious necessity for the Roman costume, was introduced simply as a means of gathering the folds of the alb together closely to the body. Sometimes it appears in the form of a cord with tassels at each end, sometimes as a flat band of linen. Though sashes were used in some localities, they are no longer permitted. Though the cincture is normally white, like the alb, it may follow the color of the liturgical office. The chasuble, originally this was the Greco-Roman pulnula, used for protection against bad weather as an overcoat or raincoat. In the 13th century, it had begun to be used habitually as a topcoat or mantle. It was round-shaped, somewhat like a bell, with the hole in the top for the head to go through. Hence, it covered the whole body like a little house, whence the name casula. The Romans also called it by another name, plantea, since it went around the body like a planet. It is this word which the Ordo Romanus Primus uses. According to the frescoes in the catacombs, the chasuble was worn by all the clergy, from the bishop to those in minor orders. We still see a remnant of this practice in penitential days, when the deacon and subdeacon put aside their dalmatic and tunic and used the plantea, plicata, or folded chasuble. With the introduction of the dalmatic and tunic as special vestments for deacons and subdeacons, they ceased to use the chasuble except as mentioned on penitential days, and it became the distinctive garb of the priest. However, even today, in some places, all the assisting clergy, whether priests or not, wear it. Since the chasuble was such a large and heavy garment, when the celebrant had to use his hands during Mass, it was necessary for him to let the front part of the chasuble rest on his forearms, thus causing an oval flow of folds. Despite many changes in color, material, and decorations, the chasuble preserved the essentials of its original form until the Baroque period made of it little more than a meaningless ornament. It is true, the type of chasuble which we today call Gothic is more akin to a later medieval development. Still, it is closer to the original bell-shaped chasuble than the Baroque product, called very incorrectly the Roman chasuble. It would be better dubbed the placard or signboard type. Not content to introduce the medieval Gothic vestment, many regions have gone back to the original bell-shaped chasuble. The cope. Unlike most of our liturgical vestments, the cope does not come down to us directly from ancient civil dress. Most liturgical authors agree that it is nothing more than a transformation of the original bell-shaped chasuble, cut in the front to allow free movement of the arms. This evolution does not seem direct, even though it would appear that the cope originally was bell-shaped and completely closed like the chasuble. Very probably the chasuble was adapted as the ordinary cloak or cape for monks. First of all, for it was precisely in monasteries of the 8th century that it made its first appearance. While bishops and priests continued to use the chasuble for most liturgical ceremonies, even for anointings and absolutions, monks began to use the cope on solemn occasions for certain parts of the divine office and for processions. With the help of Cluny, its use spread rapidly, so much so that by the 11th century it became a normal liturgical vestment almost everywhere. Originally, a hood was part of the cope. Beginning with the 14th century, the hood developed into a shield-shaped hanging sewn on the back of the cope. The dalmatic, in the 2nd century, Rome imported from Dalmatia another garment which took its name from its place of origin, the dalmatic. It was worn by important persons, and the church gradually adopted it. According to the Liber Pontificalis, Pope Sylvester, 314 to 335, granted its use to his own deacons. Later, we see popes extend this privilege to churches outside Rome. Thus, we read in the life of Saint Chartreus of Arles that Pope Simonicus, 498 to 514, gave him the privilege of permitting his deacons to wear dalmatics just as the Roman deacons did. It must have become a general practice by the 9th century, for we read in Walafrid Strabo, died 849, that not only bishops and deacons used it, but even priests wore it under their chasubles. From then on, it was reserved to the use of the person acting as deacon during a liturgical function. From the pictorial representations, we know that this vestment was a long, wide tunic reaching to the feet and having long, wide sleeves. From the 11th century on, it became shorter and shorter until today it hardly reaches the knees. At what were once sleeves are now flaps hanging over the shoulders. Some attempt has been made to restore the sleeves to their original form. The tunicle. In imitation of the damatic worn by deacons, another vestment was fashioned for subdeacons called the tunicle, tunicella. It was originally worn by the Pope himself. However, according to the Ordo Romano Primus, Gregory the Great says that one of his predecessors had permitted subdeacons to wear it. He, however, withdrew the permission. But outside Rome, it was in general use, certainly by the 9th century. The maniple. The use of the maniple is one of the many marks of honor copied from the Roman court ceremonial. When church and state entered into alliance, the Roman emperor felt obliged to accord the Pope and his officials the marks of honor due to those holding high positions in civil administration. Originally, it was a napkin or handkerchief held in the left hand by dignitaries. Just as today, a folded handkerchief in the lapel pocket gives the air of being fully dressed. It was a common thing for officials to wave it as a signal to begin plays and races. We are told by the Liber Pontificalis that Pope Sylvester permitted the Roman deacons to carry the maniple in their left hands as a badge of honor. The technical term originally used was mapula, or napkin. Later, it was called manipulus because it was held in the hand. Among ecclesiastics, it was the exclusive privilege of the Pope and his deacons until the 6th century, when Pope St. Gregory, against the wishes of his clerics, extended its use to the chief deacons of Ravenna upon the request of their bishop. He expressly refused the same prerogative to anyone else. But by the 9th century, its use had become so general that Rabanus Maurus states that his subdeacons were given the maniple at the time of their ordination. Thus we see that the maniple normally served as a mark of distinction for clerics, especially in major orders. This is further brought out by the fact that in the 12th century, on certain very special feasts, in order to be so-called fully dressed up, some monasteries had all the monks, even lay brothers, wear albs and maniples during the liturgical functions. The earliest report of a change in the maniple from an ordinary white handkerchief to a decorative strip of material comes from the 10th century. And in the 12th century, we see the beginning of the practice of wearing the maniple on the forearm instead of carrying it in the left hand. The stole. The origin and purpose of the stole as a liturgical vestment has been controverted for some time. Duchesne was probably correct when he stated that the stole was unknown in Rome as late as the 10th century, but universally adopted elsewhere. According to him, there is no Roman representation of the stole until the 12th century. It was first used in the East, and from there found its way into the Gallican liturgies, and thence finally was accepted in Rome. The first mention of the use of the stole in the East is met with the Council of Laodicea, held in the latter part of the 4th century, which reproaches those in minor orders for wearing it. In the West, we hear of the stole for the first time in 563, when the Council of Braga decreed that deacons were to wear it hanging from the left shoulder and outside the dalmatic in order to be distinguished from the subdeacons. According to the Council of Toledo in 633, for bishops, priests, or deacons to be reinstated in their office, they had to receive, among other things, the stole at the hands of an authorized prelate. Later, at a council held in Mainz in 813, it was decreed that priests were always to wear the stole so that people would know they were priests. They were even to wear their stoles on journeys. It seems that only from the 12th century on do we find the word stole itself used. Formerly, it was called an aurorium, which was taken from the Greek and designated a scarf worn around the neck. The custom of deacons wearing the stole over one shoulder from left to right also seems from the 12th century, though the rule of having the priest cross the stole over his breast is already found in the 17th century, especially in Spain. It became universal only with the Missal of Pius V. My voice is getting worn out, so I'm going to see how much is left. Enough that I don't want to do it. And we're at 2.5 hours. I don't see any questions. If you want to have questions, I'll allow it, but otherwise, I'm going to continue. Let me see. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 pages, and then one page that's almost entirely in tiny font. So that's really 12 pages. My voice is too far gone for that. Okay. Since we have no real questions, I'm going to go ahead and end it here. We'll continue the thing as soon as possible. And thank you all very much for attending.